You may have heard the famous statement by the prominent pastor and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. that I'm convinced that we shall overcome because the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. King was paraphrasing a statement by another prominent pastor and anti-slavery activist of a century earlier, Theodore Parker, who said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Both King and Parker expressed this as a statement of faith. They divined it by conscience, not by the experience of sight. But neither of these activists thought that faith meant sitting back and relaxing while the God of the moral universe delivered justice to humanity. Recent unrest over the death by strangulation of George Floyd has stirred up large sections of the moral universe, or at least the moral earth, to demand justice. It remains to be seen how many policies and practices of how many police departments will be transformed in meaningful and lasting ways from watching those agonizing 8 minutes and 46 seconds of Floyd's death. These have been demonstrations, not riots. In the first few days, some people took advantage to loot and burn. As was true in the riots in the 1960s and in 1992, nonviolent civil rights leaders, and this time the relatives of George Floyd, pled for peace. Even traces of violence work against their message for justice and peace. The reason I know that Martin Luther King and his organization opposed the violence in the 1960s riots comes from two nonviolence training sessions that I underwent in my seminary days and early ministry. The first was in North Carolina in 1964, when I was still in seminary. I spent 2 weeks with a civil rights group affiliated with Martin Luther King. We were being trained one evening in nonviolent responses in a black church when a lookout near a church window called our attention to a pickup truck which had been circling around the block of the church, around and around very slowly, with several men in the truck bed in full KKK attire. The KKK man sitting on the tailgate with a shotgun was identified to us as the deputy sheriff. We continued our training in nonviolent responses with new urgency. The second nonviolence training was in Chicago, right after the start of the July 1966 Chicago race riot. Mayor Daley had just called in the National Guard to line the major streets where there had been rioting the night before. King's group was working in Chicago that year, and I was a pastor at a Church of the Brethren in Chicago. King put out a call for black and white clergy to come that afternoon for training and an assignment. King trained us in nonviolent responses and assigned each of us to a 1 mile of a riot-torn street, to walk on the sidewalk on one side between the National Guard in the streets and potential rioters in the houses, and then to cross the street and walk the mile back on the other sidewalk, and if it remained peaceful, to do this until about midnight. King was equally concerned about provocations from rioters and from National Guard. There was no rioting that evening or afterwards, not until 21 months later when King was killed in Memphis. King could not stop that riot. Thankfully, things have changed in many good ways since 1968 for African Americans in self-image, education, housing, voting, and economics. But one thing remains the same. Almost every riot and demonstration of the past 55 years in America has involved the police, causing or implicated in triggering events. This seems to be the time to stop that. Our call is to work with the moral universe for justice and peace and love. Amen.